Hi everyone, I'm Ellie and welcome to Sewing Basics Episode 3. Today we're going to be talking about hand stitches and we're going to learn a few different techniques that you might want to know for your sewing adventures. Last week we've started on our stitch book, which is going to hold all of our samples. So if you haven't seen that video, make sure you check it out by clicking on the link right up there. Alright, so if you've seen that video and are ready to move on, let's go ahead and get started. Throughout this video, we're going to practice 5 different types of hand stitches. So you're going to want to make sure that you have your thread, needle, scissors, and fabric or your stitch book available to practice on. I'm going to be using different colors of embroidery floss for easy visibility, but you're welcome to use the same color of normal thread as you would like. So let's go ahead and get started with our first stitch. The first one we're learning about is called the running stitch. This is a very basic sewing method and is a lot like a basting stitch on your machine. To create this stitch, after threading your needle, you stitch in a straight line down your fabric, keeping your stitches and gaps even. This is not a very strong stitch and won't last if you were to sew an entire garment together with this stitch. However, this stitch is great for creating guidelines, basting, or even for decorative stitching. After perfecting the running stitch, we're going to move on to the back stitch. A back stitch is a lot like a running stitch, but it's much more sturdy and would be able to hold an entire garment together. To make this stitch, we're going to start like a running stitch, by doing one stitch on top of the fabric and one underneath. After you've done that and your needle is back on top, you're going to put it back to the end of the stitch on top of the fabric. Then as you run underneath, you're going to create another gap and repeat the process over and over, moving backwards each time you create a stitch on top of your fabric. Going back over your stitches like this locks them into place and makes it a very sturdy stitch. Now we are going to move on to some stitches that could either be decorative or used to finish your hems. We're going to be starting with the catch stitch, which could also be called a cross stitch. This is a great stitch for decorative hems or historical costuming. It's absolutely adorable once it's finished. It creates a row of cute little X's. Starting with your needle in the fabric, we're going to make a stitch on top of the fabric to the upper right corner. Then underneath the fabric, we're going to move to the upper left corner. And then again on top, we're going to move to the bottom right corner. You'll notice it creates a little X. Then underneath, we're going to just move over enough to create our next stitch and then repeat the process over and over again. It can be a little bit confusing at first. I had to try it a few times before getting it down properly. But once you have it in hand, it looks really, really cute and it's a great decorative stitch. Next, we're moving on to the whip stitch. This is one of my favorite hand stitches. I think it's really handy and pretty sturdy. I use it whenever I'm connecting 2 pieces of fabric or if I'm going to be putting one piece of fabric on top of another like an applique, kind of like the satin stitch we learned about last week. This stitch is, however, one of the hardest to make uniform. Since you're moving at an angle, your stitches are going to want to get longer and longer each time you go. So make sure you're keeping an eye on it to make sure they stay about the same length. To create this stitch, we're going to start with our needle in our fabric. Then moving diagonally, we're going to take a prick, and then with your needle facing down, you're going to go back to the bottom row. And then you'll continue doing this. It's great if you make your needle face down, it'll automatically go back to where it needs to go and it'll help keep your stitches straight rather than making them long and uneven. I love to use this stitch on raw edges, since as you're going around, it'll help to bind those edges together. The final stitch we're going to learn about today is easily my favorite, and I use it on almost every single project. This is called the blind stitch, or the ladder stitch. When done properly, you cannot see this stitch at all. And that's what makes it so awesome. It's wonderful for finishing things like bias tape or connecting your linings or finishing collars so there are no visible seams. It's a really great tool to learn and using it will really up the quality of your projects. In order to make this stitch in our stitch book, we are going to fold over our edge so we can create a mock hem. To start, we're going to hide the knot of our thread in the fold of our hem. Now we're going to go through one layer of our book, not 2 like we've been doing before. This way our seam is still hidden. we're going to make a small stitch and come out of the fabric. And then we're going to do the same thing on the fold. You're going to make a small stitch going through only one layer of the material. And then you can repeat this over and over. We call it a ladder stitch because you want these stitches to line up exactly. If you did it very loosely, it would look like a ladder, and then as you pulled it together, the stitches would come together and create a closed seam. This technique is used a lot on stuffed animals. Like if you've ever been to Build-A-Bear and got a Build-A-Bear, at the end they pull a seam and it closes your bear up. That is a ladder stitch. So, like I said, this is my favorite stitch to use. I definitely suggest practicing it and trying to use it on some of your future projects. So those are the most basic and important hand stitches in my opinion. Of course, once you've finished all of them, make sure you go through and label them so you remember what they are. And in case you ever need to look back, you have a handy little guide that you can see what types of hand stitches you know and what might be useful for the project you're working on. As always, I hope that this video was helpful for you. I really love making these and I hope that you guys enjoy them too. Next week, we're going to be going over notions such as buttons, snaps, hooks and bars, and things like that. Things that you can use to close off your accessories. So make sure to tune in then and take some time to practice your hand stitches. I will see you all then. As always, keep sewing, stay positive, and have fun. I'll see you all next time. Bye!